Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kate Miller. I'm Head of Marketing here at EcoSulis. Welcome to our Active Rewilding webinar with Nick Melleney, Nature Recovery Lead for EcoSulis. If there is time, we may have time for some live questions at the end as well. I think that's everything from me, so I'm just going to hand straight over to Neil. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, afternoon and welcome to an active rewilding session. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We're probably looking at about 30 to 40 minutes. I'm going to zip through quite a lot of kind of content, and then hopefully got some time for questions at the end. I'm Neil Melleney. I'm the Nature Recovery Lead at EcoSulis. Now, I've had quite a different journey into the world of conservation and ecology. So I've had a very practical career. Quite early on, I was studying conservation. I was really fortunate I had the opportunity to go to Australia for about 4 months. And this was really pivotal for me in getting a really good understanding of functioning ecosystems, seeing those sort of temperate, tropical, marine environments and seeing them really quite functioning. So this gave me massively increased baseline of what diversity should look like and what abundance should look like, and that's been really useful for inspiring me to think about better, more functional, more connected landscapes. There's a couple of really interesting moments whilst I was away, apart from seeing tons of stuff, having my my mind blown with diversity and species I hadn't seen before. We were up in the jungle up in the tropics. We had a balcony on our a little sort of balcony and veranda on this hut in the jungle. And what was really interesting is we went out for dinner, and one of the other guys who was staying there with us left the light on, and we came back to this hut. And I was really impressed at how quickly nature had responded to this change. So obviously the moths were drawn into this lamp that's now on in the jungle, otherwise quite dark. But not just that, you'd had a spider come and built a nest around it to catch some of these moths. And there were so many moths that actually 3 or 4 geckos have turned up, and they're taking it in turns to run in and try and steal these moths before the spider can get to them. So it was really quite an interesting example about how one action can have repercussions on the system. And another really interesting moment was the following day when we got up. I noticed that one of the guys had left a mug with a bit of beer, and I'd seen that the leaf cutter ants I'd been watching the day before had found the cup, then making their way down, drinking from it, and heading back out. And what was really quite interesting about this is that the guy came out and, oh, you've left your cup. The ants have found it, and he'd shaken it, and all the ants had fallen in, started to drown. He's going off for a shower. And I sat there thinking it's a slightly pointless activity to have done that. But anyway, I sort of watched what happened afterwards. So the ants formed a little group. They were all communicating with each other. It looked like they were having a bit of a meeting. They went back up the mug and they formed a chain, and they were dragging the bodies out of the water and taking them and carrying them off. And initially I thought, oh, this is wonderful. Got my human-centric view on it. And I'm sat there thinking, oh, look, they're rescuing them. And then I found out a bit later that taking them off to feed to the queen. But it was a really interesting example about these interactions within a functioning ecosystem and the role that can have. And that sort of active rewilding for me is understanding some of those sort of steps. So I came back from my travels inspired and empowered to get on with recovering nature and playing quite a practical role and being involved in steering and driving habitats. But I had a quite strange initial experience for those early years managing large estates and land, particularly here in the UK, is that on one hand you had this sort of landscape gardening, ground maintenance approach, which very much seemed like there was more around, I like that and I would like it over there. And what can you put in place to make that happen? How can you create a system, whether that's pipes, tubes, anchoring, changing the soil types, all of that stuff. So I found that, really quite interesting that it seemed very controlling. What I would say, though, is that on the other end of the spectrum, we also had a you kind of had conservation, very traditional conservation at the time, and it's still very much focused on trying to stop those natural processes, so controlling that vegetation cycles and change, and steering them towards a more static and fixed position. And I found both of those a little bit strange. I didn't quite fit, and I felt like I was somewhere a little bit between the two. And in terms of land and estate management, the last big estates I managed was 2009 for 5 years. I looked after two big estates for the BBC, and this was a key moment for me, really, because I was given the opportunity to drive the sites as I saw fit. And what I chose to do was change the site from a very static, almost illustration photograph of a static and fixed landscape, and change that into a much more dynamic, species-rich habitat. And it was really exciting to not only be able to do that, but to test ideas I had and had seen previously, and see how they worked and how the land responded. And what I was really surprised by is how quickly, when given even a nudge, how quickly nature can take back control of a very forced, manicured or modified landscape. And again, that really empowered me to kind of work with nature and kind of guide it along on that journey. Was fortunate enough to do some work for Ecosoulis in 2017, and worked with Nick and Kane and Susie, and completely clicked with the guys, and in 2018 joined the team here, and have been working with them ever since. So it's been really nice to bring my practical experience and knowledge and combine that with the sort of scientific and theoretical and ecological knowledge that the team here have, and yeah, try and make some improvements for biodiversity. So rewilding. So there's a description of rewilding on the screen here: spaces of innovation in conservation philosophy, theory, science, practice and finance, and characterized by a desire to restore ecosystem processes at various scales, and often through the introduction of functional species, pardon me, and the restoration of natural disturbance. So as you're all probably aware, there's lots of different flavors, and rewilding's played out in slightly different ways depending on the location and the starting point. Obviously, the well-documented sort of apex rewilding that's come from the US, or whether that's the sort of herbivore guild reintroduction practices taking place in Europe, or whether that's the sort of endemic species restoration and reintroductions in sort of Australia. They all have a place, and they all have a sort of role to play in different kind of circumstances depending on that starting point. So why do we need to rewild? Obviously, we've had generations of human overkill practices, so targeted extinctions, eradication programs, simplification of those species that are living here, along with domestication. Obviously, that was to make our own life easier, or produce food better, to a better quality and easier to handle. And we also set about ordering, simplifying, and manipulating that the habitats and vegetations to make our own life simpler, as well as kind of extracting and utilizing the resources for our own purposes. So that kind of tidying and organizing of space. So how do we go about kind of rewilding and creating this kind of wilder world? Well, we're kind of sat here in this nature depleted bottom. And again, we've got this kind of very conservation conventional ambition level, and this might be slightly further afield depending on your own baseline. Again, why I was very fortunate to have increased my own reference point. But what we want is we want to sort of learn from the past here. It's not about restoring a past point, but it is about learning from that past history of complexity and diversity, and using that to inspire a kind of more ambitious way forward, an ambitious sort of future. So that's where rewilding can play a really good, really important part. So we need to kind of think about the trophic levels, and depending on your starting point or sections that might be missing, will really kind of lead what next steps you need to take. As I mentioned already, that reintroduction of wolves had that kind of cascading effect, driving herbivore pressure, allowing things like beavers to come back in and start driving that kind of habitat and vegetation change, which has bounced back up. So let's have a little look at the kind of science and the pieces that we need to sort of have with us as we take stuff forward. So people often talk about the kind of the axis of rewilding, the kind of 3D, so dispersal, diversity, and dimensions. And that's really important to sort of frame direction of travel and what we need to think about. We also need to understand kind of vegetation cycles. So not just cycles within each habitat type. Obviously, there'd be waves of vegetation change, pioneering species, and those that follow on, and climax type species. But that's really driven by the interactions with animals in the landscape. So that movement, that dispersal, that disturbance all starts to create this much more dynamic and kind of mosaic based habitats. And we also need to remember that herbivores accelerate that kind of ecosystem upgrading. So it's important to consider those in the system. So, and again, these are not these are some pictures taken on some of our rewilding sites, and the benefits you get from those interactions are really clear to see, from that kind of disturbance to dung to vegetation change, and those fungi that feed on that dung and stuff. So so yeah, it's important that we take these images and things we see regularly when we're on our sites and take that learning forward. So what does nature need? It needs this messy chaos. So it needs untidy, dynamic, connected mosaic of habitats moving through natural cycles, through these different periods of boom and bust. And these are really going to drive forward the landscape, create that opportunity for biodiversity and as we've said already, bioabundance. So how do we kind of go about framing this kind of work? What's a good way of looking at it? Well, Rewilding Europe sat down in 2019 and they built these kind of pillars, these principles to really help guide that approach to land management and rewilding. And these are fantastic. As a business, EcoSoulis has adopted these principles themselves. And the thing we really like about them is they don't tell you what to do in a prescriptive way. They help guide your thinking. And we've deployed these in a whole host of scenarios. So we've used them in pocket sites, large landscape scale projects. We've used them on active farms where they need to continue farming, abandoned land. We've used them even in towns, in a townscape, and looking about how you might make that wilder and more connected. And even into sort of new school development. So these are a key tool for us. I love the way that they're kind of inspiring you to work at nature scale. So think creatively, making sure you're letting nature lead and offer kind of natural solutions to things. And again, another key one is kind of protecting the best and making sure that we look to kind of rewild the rest, along with some of the others that are on the screen there. So how do we complement that? Well, EcoSoulis has got our own kind of framework for nature restoration, and this is a really useful tool when we're looking at these rewilding and nature recovery projects. So what this does in complement with the principles is really kind of guide a process and a system without telling you, as I said before, that kind of prescription of what to do. And these always start with a discovery meeting. The purpose of these is a kind of combination of desk-based and then site ground truthing. And this is looking at the system itself. So trying to understand how intact it is, how modified, and what might need to be considered to move the site forward. Imagine we want a site that is dynamic. It's a whole system, like a whole body. So we need to see what framework is left, what what parts of the skeleton are still in place, and then hopefully there's still some of those key organs, and that these maybe just need a little bit of support so that they can get going and allow natural processes to continue to flesh out that site and keep it moving and being quite dynamic space. So that discovery obviously needs to be followed up with some quite detailed biodiversity assessments. EcoSulis has been looking at creative ways to try and make these more cost effective, so there's more funding left for nature at the end of it. And a really important element of that is to make it repeatable, led by scientific literature, but ideally engaging for people, creating metrics that tell us something, but also that we can act upon. There's really no point in us spending all of the budget recording the declines of nature, and we've been doing that for quite a long time. So these two things, that discovery and that assessment, leads round to our vision, and that is again creating a bold, ambitious future that's not static, and where there's space for natural processes to play out at scale. But obviously, once we've got that vision, we kind of need some form of strategy, because we need to get on with implementing that. So the strategy is, again, we try to adopt these levels of ambition. So what we're looking to do with those is not give a exact prescription of one plant every 1.5 meters and X number of this species. It's much more about working out different zones of what's still functioning, and how can we steer and nudge and guide that landscape towards a more dynamic future. And then obviously we get on with the implementation, and we've been busy developing ways where we can nudge, steer and guide, as I've mentioned, that landscape without assuming too much, and again letting nature lead, harking back to those principles to guide our thinking. And once we've done that, again, it's this sort of sequence when we're into this active management of acting and then watching. So we're going to monitor that work afterwards, and we're going to see if we need to adapt that or learn from what's happening and what the site's telling us before we can kind of nudge and steer again. And that should feed back round nicely and create this continuous sort of cycle of improvement, and again moving the site to a more ambitious and hopefully nature-rich state. So what we're looking for here, we're looking for less of these sort of macro habitats where we've got large blocks of very similar habitats going on, and we're moving to this very sort of complex and diverse, multi-layered, dynamic space and habitat that's in front of us. Again, moving from a more simple straight line from the edge of an agricultural field into field margins to the woodland blocks, and creating this blended, softer sort of transitions. So we've got these varied, multicolored and very dynamic spaces. And essentially we're looking to move from this, which we see plenty of, and move into habitats which are much more like this, again full of texture, complexity, diversity, and that you've got a really sort of natural system and process happening there. So how do we need to get on with the journey of kickstarting recovery? So again, we're taking that from the discovery right through those stages, and we'll be looking at a probably degraded or very simplified and modified landscape like we've got here, and we're going to be looking to kind of drive that towards a much more dynamic mosaic, again rich in life and much more like the one we've got in the image in front of us. So we need to be looking for things like natural regeneration. We've all been on projects before where you've got some nice straight trees and people are asking you to tidy the mess around them, which may well be naturally regenerating trees. But depending on the pressure the site is under, you might need to give some of that bit of a helping hand and try and steer and protect some of that natural regen. You want to be looking to remove fences. Again, these are barriers and they stop natural movement of species. and create these much more simplified systems. So again, if we can remove fences and barriers, that's going to do us a good step forward. And we need to create connections. So how do we allow dispersal from the wider landscape onto the site and from the site off into the wider landscape? So you want to consider those sort of routes in and out of the site. And again, it's great if we can be looking to introduce grazers into that system. Again, we've got some fantastic systems like no fence, which allow us to introduce grazing animals and hold them back and keep them into different spaces without the need for large fences that we've probably just been looking at removing. And they allow us to be a lot more dynamic with the way we manage that land. EcoSulis has been carrying out a number of trials for a few years now with both cattle, collars and others. So these are a really useful tool that can be deployed on these sorts of sites. So we've got to remember that nature knows best, and nearly all of the time animals hold the key. So keeping that in our mind and those principles and trying to avoid specifications, we can kind of head forward into our kind of next steps of the project. Again, remembering that role of large mammals in the landscape, they're kind of steering and introducing new opportunity in a whole host of different ways. So all of that's our kind of backdrop. That's a little bit of theory, as a bit of structure that is really useful. But we need to head on into a slightly more active role. We're moving away from a kind of passive system, which is great if you've got large expanses of land and lots of opportunity to introduce some of those grazing animals, your sort of pigs and your other active species. So what we need to do is we need to think about how we're going to go about this active stage. So some sites are going to be constrained by size, structure, or they might currently not be in a suitable enough condition for species and animals to carry out some of those roles. So we touched earlier on about those kind of 3 Ds of rewilding, so diversity, dimension, and dispersal. We also like to think about the 3 Cs when it comes to recovery. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to add complexity to the site and the landscape. We're looking to add connectivity, and we're looking to introduce a bit of chaos. And it's in those dynamic spaces where we've really got the best opportunity for creating diversity. So one of the first things we're probably going to need to think about is actually what's the hydrology of this site, and do we need to consider recovering the watershed? So as we look at many of these sites, obviously we've touched on we should be looking to protect the best and rewild the rest. Most of our sort of farmland has been modified, and that tends to have started with the water system. So a really important first step is to look at how that site is behaving and responding, and look to restore some of that natural water flow. How do we slow that flow through the site and through the landscape? And that might be blocking up ditches and drains and changing kind of channels on site. It might be modifying or breaking up land drains. It could be introducing roughness, scrapes, rough vegetation. So it's all about that journey of water. How do we slow the flow? How do we keep more water on the site for longer? Obviously, that has a whole host of natural flood management and hydrological benefits. But what we're thinking about here is diversity, and as I said, holding back that water, and that's naturally going to start steering the vegetation into a much more kind of complex place and system. So something people jump to quite quickly is more trees. We often need. Haven't got a huge canopy cover as a country, and there's a big drive towards tree planting, but we shouldn't jump straight into needing to plant trees. So if I think of woodlands, I think of something like this image, which is a bit of ancient woodland near me. I love the fact that there's loads of light, there's lots of opportunity, tons of ground flora, it's really diverse. the trees are all wonky. Some are really close together, some are far apart. They're leaning, they're broken, there's bits hung up. And if we're looking to have a wooded block, I think we should be aspiring towards a baseline which is much richer than we often imagine. But quite often we get drawn into this. This is actually quite a nice project, but we're in the realms of tree planting, we're in the realms of tree tubes, and selecting the species and the percentage and the densities that go onto a site. We haven't had plastic for all that long, you know, that 50s or whatever it was, and trees have been growing much longer than that. So they're quite capable when given the right conditions and relieved from certain pressures. They're quite capable of growing themselves very adequately. So how do we go about that? Well, that's encouraging natural regen. This is a fantastic area of scrub encroachment creeping out from a native hedge. And this blackthorn is actually interdispersed with lots of smaller oak trees, field maples. And this is already creating a really nice thorny nursery. So we should be looking to protect and nudge and guide these areas. And again, I've been sent to sites where they've said, tidy all this junk so we can get on with our tree planting. And they're really not understanding these natural processes and trying to assume that we're able to apply a landscape approach to natural systems. And the problem is that when we start down that journey, we make a lot of assumptions and we skip forward and we introduce lots of other challenges. So where you've got very light pressure, this is a site I managed and we only had muntjac on site. I quickly noticed that the muntjac were not browsing any of our native trees. They were generally favouring a lot of the ornamentals around the building, and they weren't. We got plenty of natural regen. My predecessor had put guards around some of these, which I removed, and this also meant that when we did a planting project, I was able to take the bold decision of not putting up any guards or fencing, and we've created a really nice natural shaped trees, nice wide slow spreading canopies, and already steering that site towards a better end point. Where you have got pressure, for a few years now, we've been exploring with scattering brash. So if you imagine, again, that natural system, both these thorny nurseries creeping out from patches of scrub and a canopy of a tree falling and the canopy hitting the ground, what that does is it creates a nursery that is protecting from browsing animals, but it also creates quite a balanced growing environment. So it's protecting the saplings from wind, from rain. It's creating a more stable growing environment where there's a lot more of an equilibrium. So what you've got within these spaces is a perfect area for catalyzing tree growth. And as that stem itself and the branches break down, they're also feeding they're feeding the soil, they're feeding the mycorrhizal fungi, which in turn are feeding the trees. So this is a great way of kickstarting that. So this is a planting area. We've got tons of whips in here. And we've scattered this brash over the top. And this, as I said, this works really well. Again, if you've got a site and a whole system, this is quite easy because we were cutting back some of the hedging here because it was falling over the fence, and we've used that material and we've utilized it. So we're kind of, as I said, nudging and steering a kind of natural process. So they, as I said, we've been using these a few years now, and they've evolved to these little oak groves. This is going to be a grazed field, so we've added an extra layer of a little hazel hurdle, again entirely guard free. What was fantastic about these is that last year, really dry summer, lots of fatalities within the world of tree planting, and our planting site here with no aftercare at all since we installed them, and all of the trees were perfectly alive and flourishing. So this just goes to show that it's introducing other benefits as well. And that's a really exciting part about rewilding, is that we don't necessarily know all of the responses from nature. Some of those outcomes have been lost, forgotten, and or we didn't even know because we weren't looking. So it's really important to use these natural processes and approaches so that we're not missing some additional benefits. So yeah, this is something we're adding in on a lot of our plans where appropriate. And a couple of reasons not to be using tree guards is you often create very monoculture feeling habitats. These are, although they're not all one species, they're all one size, they're all evenly spaced, and it's fairly one-dimensional. It's only got a couple of species here. There's next to nothing growing on the ground. So even when you are able to get them away, sometimes they just dry up straight away in your tube, or sometimes they're left wrapped in their old tree protection. And even if you've been really positive and you go in and collect them before they're choking the trees that they were meant to be protecting, you've got this giant pile of stuff to be recycled. So I'm not anti tree guard, but it shouldn't be our first go-to step. And as I said, we quite often skip from what's missing in the landscape. Okay, we could do with a bit more tree diversity and shrubs in the landscape. We skip straight onto one tree every 2 meters and a plastic tube and a guard to hold the tube up. And as I said, we do run the risk of introducing quite one-dimensional spaces. So yeah, for me, let's start with those early steps of natural regen, what pressures are on site, how can we steer and guide that towards a more natural outcome. So the next step in this lovely mosaic that we're looking to create in the landscape is often people want some richer meadows. And when we saw that picture earlier of a very grass heavy sward, very tightly knitted and very little floristic diversity, introducing plants to that floristic diversity to that grassland is definitely a good step to take. But quite often you jump straight into the seeds from commercial seed suppliers. This looks great and it's a really nice meadow because it's come up really well in that first year. But what was quite interesting is that the process you tend to go on is that you're often asked to go and spray the existing vegetation using a herbicide. So you're introducing chemicals into the ground. By doing so, you're often destroying anything that might be in the seed bank, even kind of hiding. And sometimes you're asked to spray that a second time so that you do get rid of anything that comes up in the seed bank. And then you move on to your soil prep, sowing, rolling. And as I said, here we've got a fantastic meadow. We did a really good job with our sowing, but we missed an opportunity here. So a technique we've been developing for a few years now on a project we're working on one of the wildlife trusts with is a no pesticide approach. So these are amenity grassland areas. And what we've done here is we've just lightly ploughed the soil. And by doing so, we've just created enough ground for the seed to grow in. The seed has come up equally as well. But what was really interesting about the response of these sites is that in every in each of them, different areas across the town for a couple of years, the first year after sowing, all of the sites saw orchids coming up. Now, orchids have these really unique relationships with fungi in the soil. So it shows that by just light cultivation of the surface, we've not prevented floristic diversity coming up, but we've also not damaged and destroyed that really sensitive soil ecosystem. So again, if you're into if you're having to introduce diversity because you need to kickstart changing that sward, I would suggest in the first instance that you're being more like a wild boar. As we've got here, we're looking to disturb the soil and we're waiting and watching and we're looking what's coming up in that seed bank, not jumping as soon as it's got lots of pioneer plants in there, and understand whether that's actually enough just to nudge and steer that highly modified, fertilized, commercially seeded meadow. And whether this action alone of soil disturbance periodically and randomized is enough to introduce that chaos and kickstart the sort of soil system. And again, resisting the need to go and spray if you are getting an ever-growing and increasing profusion of those pioneer species. Maybe just cut them before they go to, before they seed, so when they're in flower, and that's often enough to nudge the site and steer it towards a more naturalized state. So again, it's so easy to sort of set out on a rewilding journey and jump into a landscape project without that as your intention. And the problem is that there's a specification and an approach and a technique and an equipment and a supplier for some of that stuff. What we tend to move towards, as I said, disturb the soil, see what comes up in the seed bank, carry out that monitoring, and if you do need to introduce something, could that be locally brush harvested? Could you use green hay? Could you have a high quality meadow? Green hay you can collect every kind of 3 years from the same donor site. So it's making sure we disrupt that system. And as I said, if you're starting out on a rewilding journey, keep coming back to those principles, keep challenging yourself. Are you letting nature lead? Or are you just turning it into your landscaping project where you go, I want a woodland, I want an area of scrub, I want wood pasture, I want 3 ponds and they're going to be 10 meters by 12 meters. That isn't going to lead to a huge opportunity for biodiversity. You're going to lead to probably a very static state. And as I said, you're probably well at as more of a landscape project than it would be a rewilding one. So again, this was an example where we carried out this soil prep and we waited to see what came up in the seed bank, and was really impressed that actually over years the meadow changed and developed with each of those different seasons, and went through various cycles. So this was again a good example of just nudging and steering, even in what is a sort of semi-urban meadow here. So as I said, what are we aspiring for? Set your baseline, and almost picture a kind of an ABCD of a rewilded landscape. So make sure you're being really ambitious. Make sure you're thinking beyond the boundaries and the borders. Introduce those 3 C's: the complexity, the connections, and the chaos, and the 3 D's: the dimensions, diversity, and dispersal. And try not to be in control of everything that is in front of you. As I said, it can be quite difficult and counterintuitive, but it really is so important that you carry out these disturbance events and watch and wait, and that you're equipped with that baseline information and that sort of detailed assessment of what you've got, so that you're not impacting what's managed to hang on within your site boundaries and landscape, and look to be creating those processes, natural processes in the background. And good luck. That's all I would say. So that's all the slides I've got to run through today. I can see my chat box has been buzzing with lots of questions. I know Chris has been jumping on some of those. But yeah, there you go. Thanks for joining the webinar.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Neil. It's fantastic content there, and I've certainly learnt a lot just in this past kind of 40 minutes, and some fantastic photography in there. I know some of that is your work, Chris, as well. Really beautiful images there. Yeah, got loads and loads of questions. Please bear with me. I'm just going to try and I've picked out a few as I've kind of gone along, and Chris has done a great job at answering a lot of them, and a lot of you have also chipped in with your thoughts and ideas as well, which is fantastic. So I'll just try and start from the top. So we had Oliver who kicked off our questions in the chat to start with, and we have had a few comments on the back of this. But hello, what would be the best route to make a career pivot from a pretty solitary desk job, in brackets working at a tech company, to a hands-on practical rewilding nature restoration job? Is it necessary to go back to uni? If not, what would be the best kind of experience?
Yeah, great question, actually. Thanks. Was that from Oliver, did you say, Kate?
It was,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. And great that you're looking to kind of change what you're doing. I would say you don't necessarily need to go back to university. I had a practical career, as I said at the beginning, so I didn't go off to university, but I've equipped myself with a rich knowledge from working on the land, seeing what's happening, and again, almost kind of working and living by those principles before I was even aware of them. What was really interesting is that I didn't that I was practically rewilding and actively rewilding before I even knew what it was, before I had the pleasure of a rewilding, science book from Kane Blythe and Paul Jepson to kind of guide me on that journey. So it was really quite interesting to see some of that. So I would say there's a number of rewilding type trainings popping up. I think I saw one of them pop up in the chat box, but I would say get involved, get active, and we have an internship program ourselves, so feel free to put yourself forward for that if it's an area of interest. There's nothing stopping you kind of getting involved in that. I know a lot of the wildlife trusts run practical internships, and there's an ever-growing kind of change in approach. Sort of both Forestry England and the Wildlife Trusts, RSPB, and National Trust are really applying this much more functional way of managing land. They've spent a huge amount of energy and resources holding things semi-static, seeing species decline, and they're realizing that when you play a less active role and you're nudging and allowing these natural ebbs and flows to take place, they're seeing an increase in diversity. So yeah, definitely lots of opportunities to get involved.
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil. And even just on your local kind of forums as well, it's not necessarily kind of rewilding, but I think if you're looking to get into that nature recovery kind of habitat creation kind of atmosphere, there's always lots happening in my local community. So definitely check those out as well, because there's always lots of things you can kind of get involved with.
Definitely.
The next question is from Krishna. With rewilding, in regards to animals, what about population control, or do you just leave it to nature?
Yeah, it is a tricky one. Obviously, you back to that picture of the sort of trophic levels. It's really important to understand your starting point and the scale and the connectiveness of the site. So even if you are getting animals to drive that vegetation, it's unlikely in the UK, given how constrained and fragmented and modified the landscape is, that you can just sort of drop and run and apply that passive approach. You're highly likely to need to modify the numbers, move the herds around, and play again an active role in that animal husbandry. That's where things like no fence are a real help, because you can hold them back in certain areas, allow them to poach the ground, let them perforate out and disperse into the landscape. So you're still going to be playing an active role, but let's not forget that humans have the opportunity to be this like hyper keystone species. We one of the few animals that can select the way we behave. As I introduced at the beginning with that guy in Australia, leaving the light on had an impact on the environment instantly. His behavior with the cup kick-started a process. Now, if he continues to do that, he's going to kill all the ants. But actually, that randomized disturbance is the events that trigger some of these natural processes. So definitely, we will have to play an active role in forcing those numbers, allowing them to grow, but considering their welfare and all those other complicated areas, which is where active rewilding that we've sort of touched on here very quickly can play quite an important role. And don't underestimate the role humans can have as that hyper keystone kind of species, really.
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil. A question from Anne. She's wondering if we have any partners in France.
Currently, we haven't got any partner projects. If she's aware of any or looking for a potential partnership, send us a message, because we'd be delighted to kind of work in other scales. We've got some work bubbling up in both Australia and in the other parts of Europe, and over in the States. But yeah, as I said, the vision for Ecosulis is accelerating global rewilding. So definitely, yeah, always keen to hear from anyone.
Fab. Thanks, Neil. And a question from Chris. What do you think the difference is between rewilding and managing a large nature reserve?
Yeah, I guess everything is on a bit of a continuum and a spectrum. The key differences between rewilding is, from my perspective, is that you are again applying those principles. So you're letting nature lead, you're looking at scale, you're looking beyond your borders, you're not being constrained by the system you have in front of you. But you will still have to manage certain things. It can be a tricky trade-off, and I would say those three C's I mentioned are how you go about that. So complexity, connectedness, and chaos. And you can play an active role, as I have done through much of my earlier career, even on formal estates and large grounds and public spaces. There is room to adopt those rewilding principles and have real impact on improving biodiversity and bioabundance. So I would try not to get too caught up on language. Nature's not that bothered, but try to, as I said, nudge, steer, read the landscape, see what's working, see what opportunities your disturbance has caused. You know, scraping the ground with a mower is an area where ground nesting bees and wasps can come and hibernate at night. A picture I showed you earlier. The trampled bit of ground, I got the same on where the track's coming into a field through a gate, and my tractor tracks were smearing the ground, but that's where all of the butterflies were coming to drink to collect sort of nutrients and stuff from the water as it dried up. So yeah, as I said, I wouldn't get too hung up on language, be more focused on outcomes, and making a positive impact.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. A question from Lucy Bryce. How do you think it is best to fund the work required for a rewilding project?
Yeah, great question. Is There's always been this disconnect between the people doing good work, and all of this sort of money floating around in big business. Is something that EcoSulis has recognized, and we actually set up a new company to try and deal with that. So we've spun off a sister company from our innovation team called Credit Nature, and their role is about monitoring the underlying ecosystem using science um, and some monitoring tools that they've developed, and connecting that with financial institutes. So that's one mechanism. The really nice thing about that particular approach is that it doesn't rely on carbon or biodiversity, which are they are they're benefits you get from a functioning ecosystem. So if you zoom in on the wrong thing, you're always kind of hacking the system to sequester more carbon per calculation. But actually, if you've got a rich and functioning ecosystem, it's going to be abundant with biodiversity, which will be sequestering carbon. So yeah, it's a bit of a minefield at the moment. There is lots of different mechanisms for funding work, but some of them can be quite constraining, and you can end up having to justify measurements of plants, and before you know it, you've got a grid of trees in plastic tubes when actually you've sort of chopped down that natural regen. So it's not a straightforward answer, I'm afraid, but there's ways and means out there. And as I said, feel free to check out Credit Nature, because they are looking to do something quite different in that space.
Absolutely. And I think as well, what sits alongside that is if you are kind of looking for funders for projects, it's just making sure, I think, that their kind of visions align with your own. I think it's a really big thing for us, isn't it? It's about doing the right thing and ensuring that if they are looking to invest, if they are looking to measure impact, it should be biodiversity impact and biodiversity uplift. And I think you just need to make sure that you're both aligned in your thinking before you do kind of get involved really with any kind of investors.
Definitely. And
Um,
what was really interesting about that site I looked after for the BBC is that I had a 50% budget reduction for 5 years and continued to increase biodiversity, because the tactics and the techniques we've discussed are seasonal, temporary, varying. You can use the kit you've got. You don't need to go and buy a new implement. You can use the same mower you had before. You can, there's so many different ways. I think the key is to set the vision, as we captured, you know, what's your starting point? What's your numbers? What do you want to achieve? And then you can get on with the journey of how you get there. And some of these things don't need to be expensive. It really is about having the best bang for your buck. So how do you translate those pounds into the best, you know, into the best outcomes for nature? And these tactics and techniques have worked time and time again for that. So
Absolutely. Question from Claire. In your experience, what are the similarities and differences between the NGO and the private sector? And how do you think they will function alongside each other going forwards?
I guess from my perspective, that my interaction with that question is more around the land management side of things rather than the sort of finance side of things. NGOs are becoming so much more aware and having more ability to be more dynamic and bold and ambitious in their approaches, whether that's introducing bison and understanding that and becoming much more aware about how that fits with their supporters. It can be really tricky because you can get stuck in a cycle as an NGO of having to do what the people who are funding you want you to do. But also you've got to lead them because these are the experts, you know, and they have the opportunity to sort of set a more bold and ambitious place. But I think private sector needs to step up. There's all this responsibility and requirements for, you know, ESG targets and carbon offsetting, and you know they could cut corners and just offset an imaginary project, you know, of monoculture planting somewhere else, and or they could be looking to invest and fund in positive improvements in nature recovery. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. A question from Anne. Can you plant young trees without protecting them with fences?
Yes, you can, but not everywhere and not all the time. So that was the example I mentioned earlier. We were very fortunate. I noticed we only had muntjac on site. They were only feeding on our native plants. They were browsing the bluebells when they came up, and they were eating ivy. The rest of the time, they were eating stuff from their natural range, so all the japonica species, the laurels, and introduced plants that were around the manor house. So highly successfully was able to plant trees without them. But you need to start with what the challenge is. So do you have a natural seed source? Do you have areas where you can creep? Do you have access to brash? Do you need to bring it onto site? You know, have you got parent trees? Can you bring things up in nurseries? It's an iterative journey from we'd like some trees, and without skipping straight to, oh, you need to go to a tree supplier and then you need a tube and a stake and plant them in grids and spray the ground and put a plastic mat around them and all those other landscape paraphernalia items that you can quickly end up with. So I would say, what have you got that would eat trees on your site? Is it voles, rabbits, deer? What type of deer? What's their level? Could you create some small exclosures so you're not having to put a deer fence around the whole place? If you did some small exclosures, you know, a traditional method of coppicing is the wonky branches you would angle in around the coppice stall, because deer don't like to jump into a small space they feel they can't get out of. So, you know, we've known about deer pressure for a long time and still been able to grow trees and have more ancient trees than all of Europe, or whatever that statistic was from Wild Hours this week. So it's about taking small steps and seeing what the challenge is, and then you can work out what you might need to do about managing it. So, but yeah, scattering brash over saplings works really well. Growing them on in somewhere else on site is fantastic. Trees have mast years. They produce so much seed because it's going to get eaten, and they still need to be able to produce offspring. So yeah, start with that question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. We've only got 3 minutes left, so I'm probably just going to take one, maybe two last questions. I know the chat box is going mad now. I think we're still kind of getting quite a few questions coming in, which is great. So I've got a question from Dave. Would love to hear your views on the role of biodiversity net gain credits and other financing methods for rewilding.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something that we as a team have looked at. It can be a challenge because biodiversity net gain as a tool is a fantastic tool for developers, guiding them away from the highest quality assets on the site areas of ancient woodland so that their reduction score becomes smaller and looking to uplift elsewhere on the site. But when you're trying to deploy it on a functioning site, you're almost punished and penalized for those higher quality habitats. Um, so it's possible, but you do need to be a little bit cautious. There is less because it's fixed habitat types, it makes lots of assumptions through that calculation. From our experience, going in the category of scrub allows most opportunity because that talks about percentage of open ground and individual trees and will allow that natural scrub. So that will probably give you the most dynamic mosaic that you will be able to fill in your monitoring and be compliant. And hopefully with future iterations, they will close that gap. And when we get our nature recovery networks, projects will be offsetting. If they can't inset on the project, will at least offset into similar suitable local connected habitats. But I think it's got some way to go and could be slightly constraining for a number of those projects, depending on your starting point.
Great. Thanks so much, Neil. I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up now because we've just got a minute to go. Thank you all so much for your questions. It's been great to receive them and great to see the engagement in the chat box as well. I'm sorry to those of you that we didn't get to answer your questions, but if you just would like to connect with Neil, Chris, or myself on LinkedIn, or just drop us an email at inquiries@ecosoulis.co.uk, we'll come back to you as soon as we can. As I mentioned at the start, we have recorded the session today, so we'll send out an email out to you all. We'd also really, really value your feedback from today. Any kind of positives, negatives of the day, they'll be gratefully received, and I'll pop those in the emails to you as well. We also had quite a few questions around kind of recruitment. I think it's worth us just kind of saying really that we are always looking for people to kind of deliver rewilding projects on the ground. So if you are kind of interested or know somebody that's interested in nature recovery roles, then do please get in touch with us. We'd always really, really love to hear from you. I think that's everything really for today. Thanks again to Neil, and thanks for your support as well, Chris, in the chat box. Have a great afternoon and rest of the week as well, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks all.